Hello everyone, welcome back to the Tokyo Living Podcast Injury Edition. Today we're going to be talking about running footwear, running shoes. We're going to be discussing what they do, the different types of running shoes, and the impact of these different types of shoes on injury risk and injury rehabilitation, as well as running performance. Now, why is it important to talk about this? Well, for runners, obviously one of the beauties of running is that it can be done anywhere, anytime. You don't need a partner, and you need very little equipment. The only real equipment that you need is your shoe. But for this reason, so much attention is placed on this one piece of equipment that's required. So what is the shoe's role in running as an activity? With any sort of physical activity, with any sort of sport, with any sort of movement, we have to analyse the interactions between every different segment of the body and how those interactions work together to produce that movement. We're looking at how those interactions may cause specific stress at a certain area, and in the case of an injury, we're looking at how that specific stress may cause an overload of a particular tissue and then lead to a painful experience for the individual. In terms of performance, we're looking at how the interaction between all those different aspects, those different joints, those different muscles, it can be optimized to improve performance, to, in the case of running, improve efficiency if we're talking about long distance running, and in the case of sprinting, for example, we're looking at how we coordinate those segments to produce as much power as possible in the running movement. The shoe's role in that is obviously to provide a buffer between the foot and the running surface, the external environment. And this may be an outside running surface, so concrete or grass or whatever we're running running on outside, or an external running surface like a treadmill. When we're talking about that interaction between the foot and the ground, it's not just one segment that we're considering as the foot. And so the foot is made up, as I think most people inherently understand, a lot of bones and therefore a lot of joints, because each bone has a joint between that and the adjacent bone. And so when we're running, there is a certain degree of movement occurring at all those different interactions just within the foot, just within that part of the body that is in contact with the shoe, which is then in contact with the ground. Now, this is outside the scope of a podcast such as this. We can obviously get very, very deep into the biomechanics of running, and even just what happens at the foot. It's very, very intricate and complicated. We're going to break it down into the main movements that are happening at the foot, that are relevant to the function of the shoe. The first thing to consider is that running, by definition, includes what we call a flight phase. So this means that at a certain phase in the gait cycle when we're running, neither foot is in contact with the ground. And this means that when the foot does come into contact with the ground, it does so with a certain amount of impact. It's not like we're just putting the foot down and using that to lever the rest of the body over the foot, which is closer to the biomechanics of walking. But when we're running, our whole body weight is coming down through the foot, through the shoe, if we're wearing shoes, and into the ground. And so obviously there is a certain amount of higher velocity load and an impact that occurs at that time. We also have what we call a ground reaction force. So for every amount of force that goes into the ground when the foot hits the ground, we get an equal and opposite force coming back up. And this is what we call the ground reaction force. We're talking about the biomechanics, so that's what we call kinetics. So the actual, the changes in force, the changes in location force that happens with movement. And then we also have what we call the kinematics. So this is what we talk more about, sort of joint angles. Now, as I said before, an in-depth look at the biomechanics of the foot and ankle is outside the scope of this episode. So we're going to break it down into two basic planes. So we have the sagittal plane, which is basically forward and backwards movement, and then we're going to talk about the frontal plane, which is the side-to-side movement. Now, none of these movements happen in isolation, but I think to make things easy, we're just going to separate it into these two broader categories. So in terms of our sagittal plane movement, we have what we call dorsiflexion. So if you imagine pulling the toe up toward the whole foot up towards you, and then we have plantarflexion when we're going the opposite direction, so moving the foot down and sort of straightening out the ankle. So as we come in contact with the ground, before the foot hits the ground, we have an element of dorsiflexion, and this is basically to preload the calf muscles. So when we're bending the leg up, we're basically putting the calf on stretch so that when the foot hits the ground, that calf is working to buffer some of that force. And not only the calf, but in particular the Achilles tendon, which has a really important role in shock absorption and energy transfer within the lower limb. As we start to move the knee and the hip and the rest of the body over the foot goes into more dorsiflexion. So that causes more of that lengthening of the calf. But the whole time that the calf is lengthening, it's still under active tension. So that, you're getting a contraction of that muscle, but it's happening while it's lengthening. As we start to move our body over the foot, and we call this sort of the mid-stance phase of the motion, and then as we start to move the foot behind us or move our body forward over the foot and then push the foot off the ground, then the ankle starts to go into plantarflexion. Now, I'm talking about the ankle as that's where visually, especially if someone's wearing shoes, we're seeing most of the movement occurring. However, we are getting plantarflexion and dorsiflexion through all the joints throughout the foot, and in particular through the big toe. And obviously, depending on the shoe, the shoe itself can have an influence over all those joints. When we talk about our frontal plane movement, we're talking about, in gross terms, supination and pronation. Now, these are actually combined movements, but if we think about holding your foot out and tilting the foot to the outside, that's what we would call pronation, and then when we're tilting it inwards, that's what we would call supination. If you've then got your foot on the ground and we're considering these movements in what we call a closed chain pattern, supination would be where a little bit more of the weight is on the outside of the foot, and then pronation is where more of the weight is on the inside of the foot. And I think that a lot of people will be familiar with these terms, pronation and supination. However, I think because of, as we'll talk about in a minute, the development of the sports shoe industry, these terms, and in particular pronation, has sort of been almost given a diagnostic label. I've had many people come in to see me in the clinic and say, I've been diagnosed as a pronator, as if it's a diagnosis in and of itself. Pronation and supination are very normal and necessary movements to occur at the foot and ankle when we walk and when we run. And these movements primarily occur at what we call the subtalar joint, which is the joint that is between the heel and what we call the talus, which is sort of the next joint up from the heel. However, that movement in the frontal plane occurs as with the forwards and backwards, the sagittal plane movement, it occurs throughout the whole foot. And so that whole foot is contributing to that movement. When the foot initially comes into contact with the ground, it will be in a position of supination. As we then roll over the foot, it goes into pronation. And then as we start to push off the ground, it rolls back into supination. Now, the degree to which those movements occur will depend vastly between different people, but it will also depend on the activity, whether we're walking, running, sprinting, whether we're cutting, changing direction, and the speed and the type of movement, even within an individual, will change how much supination and pronation one is experiencing. Now, when we're talking about the shoe's role in each of those kinetic and kinematic aspects of gait, we have the stack height, which is essentially how much cushion is in the shoe. And we can get very low stack heights, as like a 4 millimeter stack, or we can get up to, in some of the super shoes, up to 40 mils or more. And so obviously the more cushioning there, the less impact there's going to be with the ground, which inherently, intuitively, would cause one to think that there is less force and less sort of ground reaction force. However, because there is a dampening of the contact of the foot with the ground, it does mean that there is an element of instability and actually more muscular load required. So that's something to consider when we're looking at the amount of foam, the amount of padding that's in the shoe. We also have the drop height, which is basically the difference between the heel and the toe. And we can go from everything from a zero drop height, which is 0 millimeters of difference, so basically those are at the same height, all the way up to a higher drop height, which is somewhere between 9 and 14 mils. Now, when we have a higher heel and a lower toe, that's going to decrease the dorsiflexion requirement, so the amount of movement required in terms of bending the foot back. It will also encourage someone to run a little bit more towards the heel. So this is one of the reasons why sometimes shoes with a lower drop height are recommended to try and encourage someone to have that first contact with the ground closer towards the mid or forefoot. And then the other thing that's going to change the amount of sagittal plane movement, the dorsiflexion and plantarflexion, is obviously the structural support through the sole of the shoe. So if you have a stiffer sole, then that is going to limit the amount of movement, and especially as we get closer to the toe. So unless you're wearing knee-high boots, there's not going to be a lot of restriction around the ankle. But in terms of the sagittal plane movement that's occurring at the foot, this can be altered by the stiffness of the sole and the areas in the sole where there is a greater amount of stiffness. And then obviously in terms of altering the amount of supination and pronation, there can be all sorts of modifications to the shoe in terms of providing structural support to encourage someone. It's not going to stabilize per se, but it's going to encourage the foot to go through a certain plane of frontal plane movement. We're talking about different types of shoes. From a historical perspective, obviously when mankind started running, we most probably started running barefoot. And then over time, we obviously started walking in shoes, and then as running became more of an actual exercise activity, we started to have more specially designed shoes for running. And initially, these were more of what we would think these days as minimalist shoes. So, less stack and less drop. So, relatively thin and not much of a difference between the heel height and the toe height. As running became a much more popular pastime in the 1970s, running shoe companies obviously wanted to take advantage of this by increasing the perceived scientific design behind their running shoes, and started to provide more padding, more cushioning, a higher drop, and also more structural support. Now, in terms of the types of shoes, you have your traditional standard shoe, which in of itself covers a broad range of different types of shoes, and different amounts of sort of structural support within that. Then you have your minimalist shoes, which are generally very flexible, so there's not a lot of stiffness within the sole. These shoes generally have a low heel drop, so typically sort of 4 millimeters or less. They have low weight, they're quite light, and they usually have an absence of an external stability device. And some examples of these types of shoes, so something like a Vivo Barefoot, a Merrell Barefoot, the Vibram Five Fingers, New Balance Minimus, Nike Free. The other end of the scale, we have maximalist shoes. So these are basically the opposite. So they have a high stack height, and often a high drop between the heel and toe. And depending on the shoes, they often have much more external supportive devices within the shoe. Some popular examples of maximalist shoes are things like the Hoka 1-1 Clifton or Conquest, Skechers Go Run Ultra 2, the Brooks Transcend 2, New Balance Fresh Foam Boracay 980, Ultra Olympus, the Puma Fast 1000, the Vask Ultra Shapeshifter, Pearl Izumi's Emotion Road M3, and the Asics 33M. And then we have a super shoe, which is a little bit of a pretentious sounding term for a humble pair of footwear. But the super shoes essentially have a high stack similar to your maximalist shoes, a little bit more of a curved shape, and have a plate built in, and it's often a carbon fiber plate. And this basically helps provide a certain amount of spring and also almost sort of functions like a tendon in terms of its ability to absorb and express force. And this, theoretically, will add to the force produced by the lower limb, and therefore produce improvements in performance and in running economy. Popular brands of the super shoes are things like the Nike Air Zoom Alphafly or Vaporfly, the Saucony Endorphin Pro 3, the Adidas Adizero Adios Pro 3, the Ultra Vanish Carbon, the Asics Metaspeed Sky and Metaspeed Edge, the Brooks Hyperion Elite 3, the Puma Fastar Nitro Elite, and the UA Flow Velocity Elite. So how is all this relevant to pain and injury? Now, if you followed basically anything that I've said in relation to pain and injury for a while, you'll know two things. One is that pain, and therefore, as an extension of that, running-related injury is extremely complicated, is extremely complex, and there's so many different systems that are interacting and all have the potential to both contribute in small amounts to someone's pain experience or be the major cause of someone's pain experience. And so it's unlikely that one facet, such as footwear alone, is enough to drive someone's pain. The thing is that all pain and injury is driven by load and a mismatch in terms of someone's current load tolerance and the load that they're placing on their body or on the relevant injured structure. So when we're talking about footwear is just one aspect of load. And so when we look at maybe a change in footwear, we need to understand that even just from a biomechanical perspective, if we change the load by changing the footwear, we're essentially just moving that load somewhere else. So, for example, if we go into a minimalist shoe, we might experience less load and therefore less stress at the knee joint, but we might in fact be placing more stress at the ankle and the foot. So this can be really useful when we're talking about injury rehab or injury management in terms of being able to distribute the load somewhere else in the body to offload a sensitized area. But when we're talking about injury prevention for someone who hasn't experienced injury, then we've got to look at all the contributing factors to someone's injury, and if there are certain parts of the body that are more predisposed to injury in that individual, then maybe a particular type of shoe might be relevant for them. But in the absence of that, we've got to think about the overall load and how footwear selection plays a part in that. The greatest injury risk comes from when we move from one extreme to another. In any activity, if we go from one extreme to the other in terms of volume, so we go from running twice a week to running 6 times a week in the same session volume, then obviously that's a massive increase in load, and that can predispose us to injury. Likewise, if we move from a maximalist shoe and go straight to a minimalist shoe, then that's that's a big change in load, even if we're doing the same amount of running volume. And so that would set us up for a potentially higher risk of injury. So we've got to look at, if we're looking at changing shoe type, then we've got to be looking at what we're changing from and what we're changing to. And the bigger the deviation, the bigger the difference between our old footwear and new footwear, the slower and more gradual that change needs to be. Now, what about someone's biomechanics? Can we use that to guide shoe selection? We know that someone's resting position of their foot, so if we just have someone standing and we look at the static position of their foot, that has very little correlation with injury risk. When we're talking about running technique, both from a perceived running technique or even from running assessment, it's actually very difficult to get the amount of data required for it to be useful in shoe selection. So a lot of people, even though they might say that there are, they heel strike or they midfoot strike, a lot of people don't actually have, even experienced runners, a good understanding of their running technique and running biomechanics. So it's difficult to guide someone based on their own interpretation of their running technique. In terms of running analysis, now we do perform running assessments within our clinic, but I personally don't feel like we can get enough data without complex motion capture systems and a very detailed and very lengthy analysis, because really to get good informative data, you actually have to analyze someone over a certain amount of time and also in a state of fatigue, because running injuries, unless you're sprinting, running injuries don't generally happen in the first couple of minutes. They happen because of that cumulative load, and some of that is a cumulative load on the tissues, but it's also related to the fatigue that happens both aerobically and also in the muscular system that predisposes that individual to excess load on a tissue. So again, as a general rule, looking at someone's running technique or asking about running technique also doesn't provide great data in terms of shoe selection. We also can see people become borderline obsessed with the wear patterns of their shoes. So where the soles of their shoes, whether it's on the inside or the outside, start to wear down. However, there's not a lot of research to suggest that is relevant to running risk, running injury risk either. So that's not something we really put too much stock into. We do look at the general wear of the shoe, but that's more just to assess how beat up it looks and when someone might require a purchase of a new pair of shoes. The other reason touted for the advantages of a minimalist shoe is that it strengthens the deeper, or what we call the intrinsic muscles of the foot. Now, there's studies to show that walking around in a barefoot shoe and doing very isolated intrinsic muscle strengthening exercises produces similar benefits in terms of muscle strengthening. And so, from that perspective, if you're going through your normal life, if you're just walking around in barefoot shoes, or you're maybe doing resistance training in barefoot shoes, that's probably going to have a net positive effect on the health of your foot. And with specific foot and ankle conditions, that can be an important part of the rehab process. But there's a big difference between doing some of your running and living in a barefoot or a minimalist shoe to strengthen your intrinsic foot muscles than just running in the shoes. And so if you are sort of looking at it for that perspective, from that perspective, it's probably worth consulting with a physiotherapist or experienced trainer or strength coach in this area to see whether that's something that is going to be beneficial for you. I'd also say that a lot of intrinsic foot muscle strengthening programs are probably not intense enough to produce the adaptations that one might experience, that someone might not experience with walking around or running in barefoot shoes. So I think that even if you are going to use wearing barefoot shoes as a strengthening modality, that should still be supplemented with some more specific and higher load foot strengthening exercises. And it should also be supplemented with calf exercises. And if you're a runner really of any kind, even if it's just 4 or 5 Ks a couple of times a week, I think that all runners can benefit from some supplementary strength training for the calves. So you're working on the capacity of the calf muscle, but also the capacity and the load tolerance of the Achilles tendon. There's a common phrase used in running strength and conditioning that the magic happens below the knees. So calf strength, this is, I guess, as a side note, but is critically important for running. So if you are running, you're not doing your calf strengthening, then that's really something that you should consider implementing in your routine. Now, one of the common recommendations for shoe selection is to guide the shoe selection based on comfort. Now, this is, as me as a practitioner, is generally something that I recommend to people. So, if you are sort of happy with the shoe that you've got, but you maybe want to try something different, look at picking a few pairs of shoes that are similar to what you have, trying them on, doing a little bit of running and seeing how they feel. So amongst running, rehab running performance professionals, this is a common recommendation. However, it's important to note that this isn't particularly evidence-based either. So whilst it is something that a lot of people recommend, we also don't have that much more literature supporting this as a method than we do for some of the more, I guess, complicated and seemingly technical methods of shoe selection. However, at this time, I think that it's probably still the best option for most people is to base their shoe selection on comfort. When it comes to performance, this is where the super shoes really sort of come into their own, because the evidence that we have does suggest that they improve performance by around 4%. Now, this is just a sort of average figure. There are people that report a decrease in performance with the super shoes, and there are people that report a much greater improvements in performance. But across the spectrum, the studies that we have with the newer super shoes, a 4% increase is around average. Now, the reason for this improvement, we have this high stack height, which allows more foam and different types of foam. So, generally, the traditional filling of a sole of the shoe is EVA foam, which has about a 65% energy return. The newer super shoes, such as the Nike Vaporfly, have up to an 87% energy return. So it's basically just more spring in the foam that's in the shoe. As we mentioned before, there's a carbon fiber plate built into the shoe, and this basically helps with that energy return as well. And it also decreases the force requirements from aspects of the midfoot. And unlike with other types of shoes, it doesn't seem to transfer that force to other areas. So it's basically just decreasing the overall force requirements of the foot. When we talk about the performance improvements, this, however, seems to be greater in slower runners. So basically, the faster you are, the less performance improvement that you can expect from these shoes. The other thing to note is that these shoes do wear out a little bit quicker because of the type of foam, and because they have to fit so much foam into the shoe and make it light enough, it does decrease the rate at which these degrade. So they're more expensive and they're not going to last as long. So if it's still worth that slight improvement benefit for you, there is evidence behind that, but just note that you're going to expect to have to buy these relatively regularly, and a decent price tag that comes along with them. Now, the last thing we'll touch on is how frequently we need to purchase new shoes. Now, the foam in the shoes will wear out at some point. So there is some failure point, and it's generally sort of the outside of the sole of the shoe that will wear first, and then once that wears out, then the inner part will degrade fairly quickly. Now, the common recommendation is to change shoes every 500 miles. However, this was performed on EVA in sort of engineering designed studies, and not always in relation to shoes. It's basically just testing the capacity of EVA. These days, not all shoes are made of EVA. They're made of all types of different foam, and so we don't have sort of studies for the individual foam. That data will come in due course, but it's at the moment we don't really have those sort of figures. So because of that, it sort of becomes more important to actually look at the as we talked about before, the overall wear patterns of the sole of the shoe, and also the feel and I guess the subjective feel of how the bottom of the shoe interacts with the foot, and how you feel that changing, and the amount of cushioning and the amount of support over time. So, in summary, if you are quite comfortable with the shoes that you're running in, but you feel like you may need to change to a minimalist or maximalist shoe for injury prevention, at this stage we don't have any real research that one is more advantageous than the other, and really comfort should be the guide when you're choosing your shoe. If you are injured, then shoe selection becomes a little more important, and it may be worth consulting with a physiotherapist to see if certain shoe types might be more effective than the one that you're currently using to offload the sensitized area of your body that's causing you that pain experience. If you are after an improved performance and are willing to pay a little bit more for a super shoe, and you're comfortable running in more of that maximalist shoe with a high drop height and a thicker, more cushioned shoe, then that might be something that you want to explore. And as we mentioned before, if you are running, then calf strengthening is a really important aspect, and it only takes a couple of minutes, a couple of times a week to get a good, solid calf strengthening program in, and that's something that I definitely recommend. And the final thing to keep in mind is that, as we said at the start, footwear is only a small aspect of running injury risk and running injury cause. So if you are experiencing injury or pain related to your running, then I think that it's best to consider all aspects. So that might be your sleep, nutrition, life stress, the impact of other activities, the impact of work, and how all these things may be contributing, and also past injury, biomechanics, other areas of the body that might not be functioning as well as they should. All these probably have a much larger impact on injury risk and injury cause than the footwear that you're using. So again, if you are experiencing pain and you want some guidance and assessment in terms of what might be causing that and the relevance of your footwear, then come and see us, and we'll do our best to help you out. Hope that was of interest to people. Thanks for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.